What happens when defiance becomes his voice and pride his shield? What if his power wasn't just in his fists, but in his unbreakable spirit to stand tall in an era that demanded submission from men like him? This isn't just the story of a fighter. This isn't just about matches, titles, or fame. This is the story of resistance. A resistance fought with gloves and grit, waged in the ring, in courtrooms, in streets, against crowds waiting for his fall. It's the story of a man who didn't just battle opponents. He challenged the status quo. A man who refused to be small, to stay quiet, to dim his light for comfort. His name was Jack Johnson, and he didn't tiptoe into history. He stormed in, a nation divided. The year is 1098. The United States is a country still shaped by its past, decades after a war that split it in two. But the divisions remain. Lines are drawn, not just in law but in life. For many, opportunity is limited, and the rules are unequal. To speak up is risky. To stand out is dangerous. To rise, that's unheard of. Yet in Galveston, Texas, a boy grows up with a different fire. A boy who won't learn silence. A boy who won't bow to fear. That boy was Jack Johnson, and his very existence, bold, unyielding, defiant, would shake the foundations of the world around him. Because whispers spread, whispers that a man once denied his chance might soon claim the highest honor in sports. The heavyweight championship of the world. For some it was unacceptable, for others it was hope. The making of a fighter, born in 1878, just years after a fractured nation tried to mend. Jack Johnson entered a world where freedom didn't always mean equality. His parents knew struggle. Now free but never fully seen, Galveston was rough, a port town of grit and survival. And there among the docks and dust, Jack found his calling. He didn't fight for glory, he fought to survive. His early battles weren't in ground arenas, but in back alleys for scraps and respect. The reward a few coins, the risk everything. But Johnson was different. He didn't just fight to win, he fought to master. Where others relied on force, he used finesse, timing, strategy, skill. He didn't just throw punches, he orchestrated them, and through it all he smiled. That smile became his signature, a grin that said, "You can't break me." But the world feared men like him, and as he climbed the ranks, one truth became clear: he wasn't just chasing a title, he was racing toward a collision with history, breaking barriers. By the early 1900s, boxing wasn't just sport, it was a battlefield of pride and prejudice. The heavyweight title wasn't just a belt, it was a symbol of who could be the best, and for years that title had a barrier, one not of skill, but of race. White champions fought, white challengers. Others were kept at arm's length. The reigning king was Jim Jeffries, an unbeaten titan who refused to face Johnson, not because he wasn't worthy, because he was too dangerous, and not the right kind of man. Jeffries stepped away, claiming he had nothing left to prove, but the world knew the truth. Still, Johnson kept winning, fight after fight. He outclassed opponents. Effortlessly, ruthlessly. He wasn't just strong, he was brilliant. And outside the ring, he lived boldly. Fine suits, fast cars, unapologetic confidence. He was everything the world told men like him not to be. By 1998, the world could no longer ignore him. A new champion, Tommy Burns, held the title. Johnson chased him across oceans, demanding a shot, until finally in Sydney, Australia, before 20,000 eyes, the impossible happened. A man once denied his chance stepped into the ring for the world title. December the 26th, 1908, a line crossed. Under the Australian sun, Jack Johnson didn't just face Tommy Burns, he faced history. The fight wasn't close. Burns swung wildly, Johnson smirked. Burns grew desperate, Johnson grew sharper. 14 rounds of dominance, punches, patience, precision. Until officials stopped the fight, trying to halt the inevitable, but it was too late. Jack Johnson had won, the world had a new heavyweight champion, and everything changed. The hunt for redemption. Johnson's victory sent shockwaves. For some, it was a triumph. For others, a crisis. The response: a desperate search for a savior, a great white hope to reclaim the title. Many tried, many fell, then came Jim Jeffries, lured out of retirement. To restore order, the fight was set for July the 4th, 1910, Independence Day. The stage was set for a battle beyond sport. Over 20,000 packed the arena. Millions watched, and in the ring Johnson smiled. From the first bell, Jeffries was outmatched. Slower, heavier, lost. Johnson toyed with him, dancing, taunting, striking. By the 15th round, Jeffries was on the canvas. The great white hope had fallen, the cost of victory. What followed wasn't celebration, it was chaos. Across the country, anger erupted, violence flared, lives were lost, all because a man had dared to win. But the real punishment wasn't fists. It was the law, the crime of being unbroken. Johnson didn't just win fights. He lived without limits. He loved openly, dressed boldly, refused to hide, and for that the system came for him. In 1912, he was charged under a law twisted to target him. The accusation, a false crime built on fear. The trial was a farce. The verdict, guilty. Rather than submit, Johnson fled, living in exile for years, fighting, surviving, never bowing. In 1920, he returned, serving a year in prison, not for a real crime, but for living too free. But prison couldn't break him. Nothing could. The legacy lives when Johnson walked free. The world had moved on, but his spirit hadn't. He performed, wrote, told his story, unbent, unbroken. And though the ring forgot him, history couldn't. Every fighter who came after stood on his shoulders. Every man who refused to kneel carried his fire. On June the 10th, 1946, Jack Johnson died in a car crash. Reports say he'd just been turned away from a segregated diner. He drove off, angry, proud, still fighting, and then he was gone. But legends don't die. A world redeemed. Decades passed. The world evolved. In 1990, boxing finally honored him. In 2018, his name was cleared, a century too late, but it mattered, because at last the world admitted, you were wronged. You were great, and we remember. So what happens when a man refuses to kneel? He stands. And in standing, he forces the world to see itself. Jack Johnson wasn't just a champion, he was a revolution. Flawed, yes, fearless always, and that made him unstoppable. The unbroken champion. Jack Johnson's story didn't end with a belt or a prison cell. It didn't end with the roar of crowds or the silence of exile. His story lives in every man who refuses to be defined by the limits set for him. Because the truth is simple, that some men fight for titles, others fight for something far greater, the right to be free, the shadow of the crown. After losing the title in 1915, Johnson never reclaimed it, but titles fade. Legends don't. He continued fighting, sometimes in rings, sometimes in courts, always against the world's expectations. Age slowed his hands, but not his spirit. Time weathered his body, but not his defiance. Because Jack Johnson didn't just carry a championship, he carried a truth too heavy for his era to bear. A man's worth isn't given, it's taken. On that June day in 1946 when his car veered off the road. Some called it an accident, others called it fate. But those who knew his story understood Jack Johnson didn't crash. He escaped the chains of a world that never stopped trying to break him, the echo of a revolution. Years later, when another fighter stood over a fallen Sonny Liston shouting, "I shook up the world." He was standing on Johnson's shoulders when a gold medal winner raised his fist on an Olympic podium. He was echoing Johnson. Rebellion, when a modern champion speaks out unafraid, he's speaking Johnson's language. Because the fight was never just about boxing. It was about the right to be seen, heard, and feared. The last laugh. In the end, history proved Jack Johnson right. The laws that jailed him overturned. The hatred that chased him faded. The fear he inspired justified, because the world did change, just not fast enough for him to see it. But that's the price of being first. You don't get to see the victory, you only get to plant the flag. The lesson of Jack Johnson. So what do we learn from a man who refused to fall? That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to let fear decide your fate. That strength isn't just in muscles, it's in the will to keep standing while the world says kneel, and that freedom isn't given, it's taken, one defiant step at a time. Jack Johnson's name isn't carved on trophies as much as it's etched into history, not as a champion, not as a rebel, but as a man who looked at a world designed to crush him and dared it to try. What does it take to challenge an entire system with nothing but a voice? What kind of courage does it demand to stand on a stage, in the spotlight, knowing that the world around you wants to confine you to the shadows? This is not just the story of a singer. It's the story of a woman who turned music into a weapon against injustice, grace into resistance, and a glamorous smile into a defiant symbol of power. This is the story of Lena Horne, born into a divided world. Brooklyn, 1990-17, the jazz age was blooming. Harlem was vibrating with new rhythms, but for a young black girl named Lena Mary Calhoun, Horne in the world was anything but equal. Her birth into a prominent, educated African-American family gave her a foundation of pride and strength. Raised mostly by her grandmother, a woman with strong values and an iron will, Lena was taught from a young age to carry herself with dignity. But pride didn't shield her from the cruel boundaries society imposed on people who looked like her. Her mother, Edna, an ambitious actress, took Lena on the road during Lena's childhood, chasing roles, chasing dreams, often uprooting their lives in the process. This nomadic life introduced Lena to the performing arts early on, but the most powerful influence came when she landed in Harlem during the peak of the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural explosion where poetry, jazz, and rebellion were inseparable. At just 16, Lena dropped out of school, not to escape education but to support her family, and her first stage, the Cotton Club, where black performers dazzled on stage for exclusively white audiences. The Cotton Club, a stage and a cage. Imagine being celebrated and silenced at the same time. That was the paradox of the Cotton Club, a glamorous venue that showcased black talent, but strictly catered to white patrons. Lena Horne's voice quickly became the velvet thunder, echoing through those smoky halls. But as her fame grew, so did the reality of the limitations set by the color of her skin. She was beautiful, magnetic, and undeniably talented. But to white America, she was a special exception, never truly accepted, always placed on the edge of the spotlight. Still, Hollywood came calling. Breaking into Hollywood's fortress in the early 1940s, MGM signed Lena Horne to a long-term contract, the first of its kind for a black woman. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was suffocating. In films like Cabin in the Sky and Stormy Weather, Lena shone, especially in her rendition of the title song Stormy Weather, which became iconic, but her roles were often limited to musical cameos, scenes that could be cut when movies played in the segregated South. Lena refused roles that portrayed black women as servants or caricatures. She rejected scripts that asked her to smile while reinforcing stereotypes, and Hollywood didn't take kindly to her refusal. She wasn't just a woman of color in a white man's industry. She was a woman who said no, a voice for justice on stage and off. As Lena's career soared, the world fell into war. During she toured with the Wuso to sing for American troops. But when she saw black soldiers seated behind captured German POWs, something inside her broke. She walked off stage. From that moment forward, Lena Horne insisted on performing only for integrated audiences, even if it meant losing gigs. Back home, her outspokenness made her a target. During the Red Scare of the 1950s, Lena was blacklisted, branded a communist sympathizer, not because of her beliefs, but because of her boldness. Her friendships with activists, her willingness to challenge racism made her dangerous to the status quo. But she didn't stop. She marched with Martin Luther King Jr. She worked with the NAC. She used her fame, not just to entertain but to educate, to provoke, to resist. Reinvention on Broadway. Hollywood closed its doors, but Lena found another stage. In 1981, at age 64, she debuted her one-woman Broadway show, Lena Horne. The Lady and Her Music. It wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration through song and spoken word. She told her story, the racism, the resistance, the regrets, the triumphs. Lena was no longer just a voice in the background. She became the narrator of her own history. The show ran for over 300 performances, won her a special Tony Award, and cemented her legacy as more than a performer. She was a truth teller behind the spotlight. But what about the woman behind the legend? Lena's personal life was filled with quiet strength and quiet pain. Her marriage to music director Lenny Hayton, a white Jewish man, challenged taboos in both black and white communities. Together, they defied the norms of a segregated society, paying a personal price for their love. She endured family struggles, personal losses, and the constant pressure of being the first, the only, the exception. Her friendships with other black performers like Billie Holiday and Duke Ellington grounded her in a world that wanted her to be quiet. They reminded her that her voice mattered, a legacy that still echoes. Lena Horne died in 2010 at the age of 92, but her influence didn't fade, it multiplied. Her refusal to conform laid the groundwork for artists like Diana Ross, Whitney Houston, Beyoncé, and Viola Davis. Her blend of elegance and defiance showed the world that art can't and shouldn't be separated from justice. She didn't just sing about stormy weather, she weathered it. She stood in the rain, raised her chin, and sang anyway, and by doing so she reminded us all of the power a single voice can have. So, what does it take to challenge an entire system with nothing but a voice? It takes someone like Lena Horne, a woman who refused to let her story be written by others, a performer who turned every note into protest, every lyric into legacy. She sang not just to be heard, but to be understood. And in doing so, she became more than a star, she became a spark. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.